Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
we test them all the time.
With COVID surging, Chicago Public Schools encourages students to get COVID tested before coming back to class.
Despite the pandemic, it's been a stellar year for stocks and the economy. We assess the outlook for 2022.
Why some Chicago restaurant owners are demanding more time before requiring vaccine proof from customers.
The latest on COVID cases in the county jail and juvenile detention center.
The extraordinary photographs of Vivian Maier. A biography reveals new information about the North Shore nanny turned photographer.
I'm Angelito, and coming up tonight, I'll take you to a frame shop that's making framing art an art form within itself.
It just sort of stands out and dominates the landscape.
And Jeffrey Baer explores how the iconic Wrigley building transformed Michigan Avenue in Ask Jeffrey. But first, some of today's top stories. Almost every U.S. state and 3 territories are back on the city's travel advisory list, with 2 states being added this week, Louisiana and South Carolina, as well as the Virgin Islands. Now, this means unvaccinated travelers are urged to test for COVID before and after arrival in Chicago from one of those states or territories on the list, as well as quarantine upon arrival. The city says its daily case rate is now 140.3 cases per 100,000 people. That's a more than 500% increase from 3 weeks ago, when the case rate was 23.2. The city's test positivity rate is now 15.4%. That's up from 7.4% just 7 days ago. Chicago has snow for the first time in 287 days. A winter weather advisory just ended about an hour ago after 1 to 2 inches of snow fell over the course of the day, followed by the rain some of you might be seeing tonight. Today, December 28th, marks the latest day of the measurable snow on record in Chicago. So, 2021 now has the second longest streak of days between last and first measurable snows. 2012 still holds that record of 290 days. Up next, how Chicago Public Schools are trying to contain COVID after the holiday break. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Winter break isn't over yet for Chicago Public School students, but with the crescendo of COVID cases, teachers, districts, and parents are anxiously looking ahead to next week when classes resume. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Anxious is the word. I don't know about you, Paris, but I always hated as a kid when school got back in session. Now, even as Omicron began to rapidly spread, Chicago Public Schools CEO Pedro Martinez says he does plan to bring students back to the classroom for in-person learning. He says when schools went fully remote through 2020, it was bad for children's mental health and their academics.
So I don't see that as a viable option. Now, if the whole entire country shuts down, if the entire state and city shut down, I'm not going to put my families at risk. But short of that, I see we're going to be very granular, going school by school, classroom by classroom, and we will respond based on the information we're seeing. But this is why I'm very clear with parents. I'm going to be very conservative. I am going to err to the risk of transitioning more children to remote as we see the cases.
Now, the key to bringing back students safely, he says, is COVID testing. The district strongly encouraging families to get their children tested before class is back in session. That is important, especially if a kid is unwell, says pediatrician Dr. Jenny Kuzma.
If your child's having those cold or sick symptoms, making sure that you do get them tested. So we're seeing kids who have fevers, coughs, runny noses, sore throats. All of those could be symptoms of having a COVID-19 infection. So if your child develops those symptoms before going back to school on Monday, we definitely recommend that they get tested.
That may be easier said than done, though. Rapid tests are hard to come by, and for some families, they're just too expensive. Free tests in demand, too, with lines to get one. To get help with that, before break, CPS sent 150,000 COVID tests home with students at 300 of the schools hardest hit by COVID. Today, the deadline to get them in, either to libraries or to FedEx locations, so that there is time for them to be processed before school is back on Monday. But the Chicago Teachers Union sent photos of overflowing FedEx boxes, a visual sign, the union says, that the district isn't prepared.
Here we're talking about something to make sure people aren't getting sick so that we can have it safe enough in the buildings so that we continue to have in-person learning, right? That's the goal, to have safe in-person learning. If you don't have that, then it's not safe, and we have to do something different.
Now, New Year's is another time, of course, there to be gatherings and then a potential for there to be more coronavirus spread. And that hasn't even happened yet, says CTU Treasurer Maria Moreno. CTU wants things like more air monitoring in schools, metrics for when schools must go remote, and rapid tests on that first day that school's back in.
For all students and all workers in the building. So when they're coming in the morning, they should be tested. That will give us a clear indication of, where is the level of transmission of COVID in the homes, right? And I think that's a very big concern because we really don't know what's happening in the schools because there's very little testing going on.
And now you have guardians needing to sign their children up to allow them to be tested in schools. CTU wants the opposite, so that you basically automatically be opting into testing unless you choose not to. Now, that is a no-brainer to Burr Elementary, that is, parent Rachel Winkleman. She says, yeah, it's a no-brainer.
There's just so much stuff that you get sent home from CPS that I could have easily missed the option to sign my kids up for testing. Like, I did it, and I think just because I was very hypersensitive to COVID stuff at that time. But there have been plenty of other things in the history of my kids going to school that I have missed, and I bet you a large percentage of people who are not signed up just kind of missed the details on signing up, but would be perfectly happy to have their kids tested in school.
Though it would be hard to miss CPS's reminders to test students and to get those rapid kits back in, she says that she and other parents feel like CPS is calling so often to give them those reminders that it's bordering on excessive. Winkleman wants her 7- and 9-year-old students to be back in class. She says they're happier, and even with Omicron, she feels that they're safe.
The whole system of masks and kids sitting apart at lunch and then spending more time outside seems to work. So I feel like maybe the old metrics might have been too conservative, which we just kind of like knew what we knew at the time. But I think at this point, we can kind of say a lot of these like layers of safety precautions, like the ventilation system, encouraging everyone to get vaccinated, having kids tested, kids wearing masks, like it all together seems to work pretty well.
She says with the rising cases, she is canceling, scaling back some plans and being particularly cautious. But she says if there is one thing to not cancel, it is school. Now, CTU, that is, has another concern about coming back to the classroom, and that is a lack of enough adults to supervise students.
In January, you're going to have members who are infected. They're going to be sick, maybe not severely, because most of our members are vaccinated. And the staffing levels in the buildings may not be safe.
Now, the CTU is having a virtual meeting this evening to decide the union's next step. Meanwhile, the district did not specifically respond to a question about what the metrics might be that would cause CPS and Martinez to bring learning virtual. But in a statement, CPS says that it is expecting what it described as higher than normal number of classrooms to have to convert to remote learning due to the Omicron surge. The district also in a statement saying that before classes resume January 3rd, all schools are going to be cleaned, and then also the ventilation systems checked so any repairs can be done before students and teachers are brought back. The district encourages students to opt in to that in-school testing option, which CPS says is going to restart again as soon as school is back in session. So regular tests for kids probably starting up, sorry students, but also the COVID kind. And by the way, a reminder also from Dr. Kuzma, she says, students have some homework. If you're not already vaccinated, that is a really good way, the doctor says, to spend spring break and be prepared to get back in. Paris, back to you.
Extra anxiety this year about going back from winter break. Amanda, thanks very much. And the surging Omicron variant hasn't put much of a damper on the roaring economy and stock markets. When the final numbers are in, analysts expect the U.S. economy to have grown at more than 5% in 2021. Meanwhile, stock markets have delivered robust performance as the economy has rebounded from the depths of the pandemic recession. Dow Jones is up over 20%, the S&P 500 almost 30% to date, and the tech-heavy NASDAQ more than 24%. But inflation has risen to its highest level in decades, and supply chain issues persist. So just what can we expect from the economy and the markets in 2022? Joining us to share their insights are Michael Miller, Associate Professor of Economics at DePaul University, Michael Stritch, Chief Investment Officer at BMO Wealth Management, and Preston Caldwell, Head of Economics and Equity Analyst at Morningstar Equity Research. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. So we mentioned these mixed signals at the top. Mike Miller, will all of these factors continue deep into 2022?
Well, that's one of the big questions. We know that we are roughly at full employment, which is great, and we're creating jobs at a rate which will keep that full employment rate for all of next year as far as it appears. GDP is growing near its potential. Actually, it's above potential, so that's good to hear. But the one problem, of course, is inflation. And the issue there is exactly how the Fed will respond in terms of how quickly and how forcefully. And will they use just changes in their portfolio, or will they use changes in interest rates?
All right, well, let's stick with that issue of inflation. Preston Caldwell, how do you think the Fed will respond in 2022?
Well, I think it's clear that the Fed is going to proceed with a course correction. You know, earlier they were saying that the inflation was purely transitory, which meant that they did not need to hike rates. I do think that inflation is still to a great degree transitory, but as Mike mentioned, there are structural factors indicating that the economy is starting to tighten, run against its capacity a bit, and that augurs for a rate hike in several rate hikes in 2022 and 2023, even with these supply chain issues that are causing much of the inflation today being resolved.
So perhaps action to prevent against an overheated economy. Michael Stritch, the other X factor here is the Omicron variant, record-setting case numbers. Could that put a damper on the roaring economy?
Yeah, I think definitely at the margin, at a minimum, you know, what we like to look for there is not necessarily case numbers and things like that, but specifically kind of these real-time indicators as to the behavior of citizens around the country. And to date, we've seen some subtle declines in some of this data. I'm thinking of things like reservations at restaurants. We have a lot of survey data on traffic into retail centers and storefronts. Those maintain pretty robust levels, but I said we do have some slippage at the margin, so we'll have to see how the next few weeks play out. I think it probably will dent Q1 at a minimum, but as of right now, we don't think it's going to be a big headwind for the remainder of 2022.
And Mike Miller, as we mentioned at the top, the markets are performing exceptionally well. As we said, the Dow up about 30%, 20%, S&P 30%, NASDAQ 22%. Is this a case of the recovery disproportionately impacting the wealthy or those of means, or are we seeing the same kind of growth in wages among the lower and middle classes?
Well, when you look at it through the eyes of wealth, which is your liabilities, the people at the top are doing better because they tend to invest in more risky investments, and those give you the higher rate of return. But at the bottom, when you look at income, there's no doubt that the people at the bottom have been given more market power in the labor market than they've ever had in the past 25 or 30 years, where they're able to negotiate in some sense. I'm not coming to work for you unless you pay me something that is decent. And because of that, we see the wages at the bottom as they were right before the pandemic. We had the largest increases in wages for the bottom that we had ever seen. And I think we're seeing some of that coming back. And that's good for the economy. And in my mind, it's not going to be inflationary because their productivity justifies this higher wage. Their wages have not quite kept up with productivity over time. And so when they finally get their cut of the pie, this is a good thing. It's good for everybody.
Preston Caldwell, how much of this is driven by the massive amounts of government investment into the economy, the just passed infrastructure bill, the COVID relief efforts, and could things taper off a bit without that kind of federal investment?
Yeah, I think we will see an attenuation of many of the trends that we see today in terms of, the high rate of turnover in the labor market and, the labor force participation rate still being below pre-pandemic levels. It's certainly true that we had the largest fiscal response in U.S. peacetime history during the pandemic, which, if you're going to err on any side, I think you do want to err on the side of overdoing it. So, even if that did have some overheating effects on the economy, I think it was, overall a good thing considering all the risks that were involved during the pandemic. We didn't have a repeat of even the Great Recession, much less a Great Depression-sized event. And so we're looking at a much quicker economic recovery this time around. And yes, I think as the the effects of perhaps the stimulus checks and unemployment benefits and so on wear off, then we'll see a normalization of perhaps some of the areas which are worst overheating right now.
A very Keynesian type of response over the last couple of years. Michael Stritch, Chicago has seen some of that federal largesse, although its growth is lagging a little bit behind the national average. Do you expect that to be the case in 2022?
Yeah, I think so. If you look back over the last 10 years or so, it's been true to form in most instances that Chicago has lagged just behind kind of the national levels of growth. And that's likely to persist into 2022 if, for one primary reason, back to the COVID situation and its impact on hospitality and leisure and convention centers in particular, which Chicago is one of the leading convention destinations in the country. That hasn't come back really to any significant means so far, and it's looking pretty, pretty tough going for that area into 2022 as well. So if I think about the overall picture for the U.S. is, again, as Mike said, above trend growth for 22. I think Chicago comes in just below that, in particular because of the sort of extraordinary leisure and hospitality and convention exposure that we have relative to some other areas of the country.
All right, Michael Miller, we referred to the so-called great resignation earlier, people quitting, employers not being able to fill their jobs. What's really going on here, and do you think these trends are going to continue in 2022?
Well, I think we're in the midst of a fundamental change of the negotiating, so to speak, between the employer and the employee. And we also have the baby boom, of which I'm a member, that are beginning to retire. That was going to happen with or without the pandemic. We were going to have some kind of a change in the fundamental nature of the labor force. So I think it's going to be just like working remotely has become much more common. I think this negotiating between workers and businesses will continue, and we will never go back to the way it was in the past. There will not be the same kind of employment, for example, within office buildings with different small restaurants and stores, because people will be working from different locations. And so the labor market going forward, I think it's quite vibrant and quite exciting to be watching this fundamental change in labor relations between employers and employees.
Preston Caldwell, how is this going to iron out? I mean, will the skills match the jobs available? What do you see happening in that front?
Yeah, a few points. I think the great resignation term is a bit of a misnomer. Instead, we're really seeing a great reshuffling. That is, most of the people that are quitting right now are hopping to another job. They're not leaving the workforce entirely. And so that opportunity to move to another job, to get a raise, most likely is contributing to a lot of the tightness in the labor market and the wage pressures that we're seeing. Although I will say, for all the talk of wage pressures, as Mike alluded to, I mean, most of the wage pressure we're seeing is on the bottom end of the spectrum, the labor market, especially industries like leisure and hospitality as they reopen. In terms of broad real wage increases, they've been fairly muted over the entire course of the pandemic. And so I don't think we should overstate that issue too much.
All right.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. A lot to watch for in 2022, but we thank you all for your expertise. Our thanks to Michael Stritch, Preston Caldwell, and Michael Miller. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And now to Brandis and how some local restaurants are responding to the city's vaccine-proof requirement. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. Some restaurant owners are calling for more time before the city's proof of vaccine requirement takes effect at local restaurants, bars, gyms, and entertainment venues. The requirement goes into effect on Monday, but a coalition of about 30 restaurants is saying there hasn't been enough time to adjust operations amid the holidays. Members of the coalition join us now with more. Lynn DeFranco, manager and advisor at Hawkeye's Bar and Grill, located in the Little Italy district. Kim DePoffe, daughter of the owner of Pompeii, a family-owned Italian restaurant located on the city's near west side. And Roger Romanelli, coordinator of the Chicago Restaurants Coalition and head of the Fulton Market Association. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. Roger Romanelli, let's start with you, please. As the coordinator of this restaurant coalition, what pushed you to organize this movement and call on the city to postpone this requirement taking effect?
Well, that's an excellent question. When our coalition heard Mayor Lightfoot's announcement on December 21st, obviously we took note, and we felt that a January 3rd start date was fast. So we took a look at what they did in Boston and Washington, D.C. and New York City. Boston gave their restaurants 25 days, Washington, D.C. 25, New York 40 days. In Chicago, it's 13 days. And it's right during the holidays when restaurant owners are busy and swamped and planning to spend time with their family members. Look, there's a lot of details involved with checking vaccine papers and having restaurants ready to go. We want to help the city be safe. Restaurants want safety for their customers and their employees. 13 days right after the holidays, I'm sorry, that's just not fair.
Kim DePoffe, what are your main concerns with this requirement?
Concerns is just the flow and what this is going to do to our customers even walking in the door. So we need more time to get the rest of our employees that maybe are not vaccinated, give the customers more time to get vaccinated. But the flow is our biggest concern because we're a fast casual restaurant. So just where are we stopping the customer? Are we catching them outside? We don't want anybody standing outside, waiting to come into the restaurant at this time of the year. If we're bringing them in and then turning them away, how does that make us really look? And what is this effect going to have on our employees as well?
Lynn DeFranco, what about you? Is this just about not having enough time to prepare for this requirement, or is it more than that for you?
Well, it's more than that, but certainly the time element is huge. I mean, we have, as most restaurants do, various corporate parties and organizations. They want to either celebrate Christmas Eve or they wanted to spend New Year's Eve with us, or New Year's Day, as a matter of fact. So we're using our staff to fulfill customer responsibilities. The time, of course, is needed to comply with the restrictions and the covenants that are in the city's website, on their website. For instance, you need a safety coordinator. Well, okay, I guess that's somebody, but, you have a lot of shifts when you come to running a restaurant or any type of hospitality. So that means you'll have to have several safety coordinators. I assume, I don't know, since there's no other guidance other than the 2-page letter that was sent out by City Hall. You have a situation where there are, during the day, we'll have anybody that's near the front will walk somebody in to the restaurant, to the dining area, and seat them. There's not a hostess per se, kind of like Pompeii, Kim's establishment. So they're sitting down now. I suppose we have to go over there if they grab a seat and ask for the vaccination card. Then we have to keep records of all of this.
So obviously, it sounds like a lot of steps that each of you would have to take to implement something like this. Roger, you know, if restaurants had been given more time to prepare for this, do you think a vaccine requirement like this or a proof of vaccination requirement like this could improve the COVID surge?
Well, you know, that's a very good question. I personally listened to what the restaurants wanted to do here, and the restaurants wanted to comply with the order, but they wanted more time. In terms of dealing with the COVID surge, we really need all hands on deck. And again, like I say, since the pandemic began, the restaurants have been doing wonderful work to keep everybody safe. I would just say to you that if the mayor's intent is to get more people vaccinated and for us to defeat the virus, then if it's good for restaurants to check vaccination papers, anyone that walks into City Hall or any government building in Chicago, they should also be required to show their vax papers and their IDs. Look, we need an all hands on deck, and we cannot portray restaurants as dangerous spots alone.
Roger, what response have you received from the city about your request for more time?
Well, you know, I will say, unfortunately, the mayor and her staff yesterday just dismissed it outright, and we're saying January 3rd. And, you know, unfortunately, they also said something like, we're holding seminars. They had one seminar on the 22nd. They're having one on December 29th tomorrow, and they're having another one on January 4th. But all of this is on the fly, and it's simply a matter of, you know, we know that the mayor and the city staff want to get a handle and defeat the COVID virus. We all do, but restaurants are not departments of the city government. All businesses deserve, just like in Boston and DC and New York, they deserve at least 25 days to implement these very serious requests. So the mayor's staff has said, no, we're going ahead with January 3rd, and the fines could be up to $500 a day.
And hopefully we'll be able to come back to that. But Kim, you know, what kind of response are you expecting from customers when this goes into effect next week?
You know, the initial response we heard last week was, we're going to the suburbs. And then it was expanded to the entire Cook County. So, you know, that helped us a little bit. So I hope we don't lose the customers that we're finally getting back into the restaurant this past year.
Okay. Lynn, what about you? You know, what challenges do you expect for your restaurant, especially when you maybe encounter a customer who does not want to comply?
Well, here's my bigger concern. A single customer or a couple we can probably handle. But what happens is you have groups coming in. We're very near the university, and you'll have a bunch of people coming in, groups, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have to check them all, which is, I guess, what we're going to have to do. But suppose one is not vaccinated. Do we lose all of them? There are going to be a lot of irate customers. And some of these people come from out of town, so they don't know the rules, and it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess. I don't think it was well thought out, and we're all going to have the same problem.
Okay. Complicated. Obviously, we will wish each of you the best of luck next week. Our thanks to Len DeFranco, Kim DePaufy, and Roger Romanelli for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. There's much more ahead on the program, including a spike in COVID cases at Cook County detention facilities. But first, for the last 40 years, a family business has been committed to preserving Chicago's art scene, whether it be through engraving pieces or framing them. Now they've taken a turn in how they're enhancing artwork through a custom framing process. Arts correspondent Angel Ito takes us to Frame Chicago and shows us how they're pushing the envelope in how collectors preserve their art.
When the Rajani family immigrated from East Africa as refugees in 1972, they initially started a business that enhanced their skill sets.
We worked really hard to get where we are, you know. We came with nothing.
And then as a chemist, I formulated inks and coatings and colors. So the color was very passionate to me, developing the colors and formulating the inks. So it was pretty natural for me to work with the colors.
They started out engraving before moving on to framing pieces. Now, 40 years later, son and daughter Shafiq and Alicia are helping expand the family business even further.
When you're really passionate about something, it just comes naturally, you know. When I see this art, I feel so happy and so excited to work with it that the design just comes to me naturally. It doesn't feel like work.
This frame is a little bit small.
The engraving business then led to the custom framing business in the early 90s. In the late 90s, early 2000s, that we moved our operations to Lincoln Park, and that's where we found a new community of art collectors. The frame preserves your piece, the frame ensures that no light hits your piece, and it retains the value, right? So there's always been an importance to framing.
What makes Frame Chicago style so special? It's the walls they build within their frames to enhance the artist's creations.
Every time a new piece comes in, we're looking to see what can we do different than we did last time, how can we enhance the piece. That's where spray paint comes in, color frames come in, painting the frame, painting the mat, floating in different directions, putting double or triple frames.
In-house, Frame Chicago has a small team of both artists and framers that help bring these ideas to life in a quick turnaround.
We've got our frame built and we've got our art.
Some might argue the work the Rajani family does oversteps the artist's initial creation. But one artist that frequently works with them says while their style might not be for everyone, it is for him.
People don't understand the importance of art in framing. There's a matrimony between the art and what it's encased in. And a lot of people, I think, undervalue and try to go with something cheap for their frame. Taking it a step further and understanding framing as art and seeing some of those framers that push that envelope or the boundary and explore and experiment is exactly what artists do. So there's an artistry to it. So I love it. I don't think I love every single framing that's done by anybody, but I'm always blown away by those that push the boundary.
As Frame Chicago evolves into a brand that also showcases local artists such as B. Moore, J.C. Rivera, and Kayla Sansing, to name a few, the core of their business will always be rooted in the art of framing.
When you put it on your wall, it's the piece and it's the frame that essentially enhance it to really bring it out. So we're creating a collector's item on top of a collector's item. What Frame Chicago has done is essentially said, we're going to make that frame a one-of-one.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
And whether you're a longtime collector or a first-timer, Frame Chicago says they're committed to making art more accessible for everyone. Visit our website for more information on their custom framing process. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, the latest on the state of COVID-19 in the county's jail and juvenile detention center. Extraordinary photography from a North Shore nanny. A new biography offers fresh details about the life of Vivian Maier. And 100 years of the Wrigley building. Jeffrey Bayer explores how the iconic structure ushered in the Mag Mile we know today. But first, some more of today's top stories. Chicago will not set the record for longest snow drought. The city, however, did set a record for latest first snowfall of the season. Most of the city saw less than an inch of wet snow before a lot of that snow turned to rain, although parts of the region saw between 1 and 2 inches. All of Cook County spent much of the day under a winter weather advisory as today's event ends a 287-day spell without any snow. The all-time record was set in 2012 at 290 days. Another huge day of COVID cases. State health officials report more than 20,800 new confirmed cases in the last 24 hours, bringing the 7-day average of new daily cases above 16,000. That is the highest number of the entire pandemic. The state also reports 96 new deaths. That's the highest number since February. The statewide test positivity rate is at 12.4%. And the situation is similar throughout much of the country. Today, the city announced 3 new states and territories were added to the city's COVID travel advisory. They are Louisiana, South Carolina, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And that leaves just Montana and Guam as the only states and territories currently not on that advisory. And now, Brandis, back to you with the story of COVID in the Cook County justice system.
Paris, thank you. So today, Chief Judge Timothy Evans announced that his office's 2,600 employees will have to be vaccinated to return to work with limited exceptions. Now, that includes judges and workers at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. This after the chief judge was criticized for previously not mandating the vaccine for all employees. The move comes as the county has seen a spike in cases, including among Cook County jail detainees, with the most recorded cases at the jail since mid-December 2020. That's before vaccines were made widely available. Joining us to talk about this decision from the Chief Judge is Amanda Klonsky, Research and Policy Fellow at the UCLA Law COVID Behind Bars Data Project and a member of the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center's Advisory Board. We should also say we did invite Chief Judge Timothy Evans to join us this evening. He was unavailable, but his office did provide a statement, which we'll get to. Amanda, thank you for joining us. Now, that statement from Chief Judge Evans, it says, quote, "This step is being taken to ensure the safest possible workplace for our employees and to protect employees of our justice partners, court services patrons, residents of the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and the general public." Amanda, what is your reaction to this change?
Well, this is welcome news. It's been a grim and scary Christmas holiday for youth detained in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, where COVID numbers are on the rise. At least 6 detained children and 7 detention center staff, along with a growing number of court and probation staff, including 2 judges and 37 employees, have now tested positive for COVID. But as you mentioned, there was some good news tonight, just a few days after a WBEZ story on the lack of a COVID vaccine mandate at the Cook County courts. Chief Judge Evans has now announced that judges and other court employees must get their first dose of the COVID vaccine within 21 days. Of course, it's been more than 8 months since they could become vaccinated.
And to that point, Amanda, so unvaccinated employees, you just said they have to comply with the mandate within 21 days. We know that Omicron is surging right now. Are you still concerned about a big spike in cases?
Of course we are. This surge could have been and was correctly anticipated by public health experts. We knew this was going to happen. We're seeing a major surge in the Cook County Jail, in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and across the system. So it's baffling to me that there was no mandate until tonight. And of course, that we're postponing the mandate for 21 days, that people don't even have to have they don't have to complete the vaccine series within 21 days. They have to get their first dose within the next 21 days. But still, this is major progress. This is an important step forward, and it will protect public health, and we hope will save some lives. Don't forget, the main threat to the health and safety of people who work in jails, prisons, and detention centers at this time is COVID. So this step is for the protection of people who work in these institutions, as well as for children who are detained there.
Now, as you also mentioned, the Juvenile Detention Center has had 7 residents test positive and 5 employees test positive. That's just since yesterday. Give us a sense of the mental and physical effect of COVID for young people who are in the Juvenile Detention Center.
So this failure to get the staff of the detention center vaccinated has real implications for detained youth. Imagine how scary it is to be a 12 or 13-year-old child in jail over the holidays, sleeping on a 1-inch vinyl mattress with no sheet and no pillow, away from your parents or anybody who knows and cares about you, often getting no visitors at all, and now you're terrified of getting sick all by yourself. Many of the about 157 youth in detention tonight are there simply because they have no other place to go. They're awaiting placement in a shelter or a foster placement. And people who work in the detention center are charged with protecting public safety and caring for Cook County's most vulnerable children. And instead, those who have refused to get the vaccine are now endangering all of us. Don't forget, people come and go from the juvenile detention center every day. These staff carry the virus with them into the detention center where it quickly spreads, and then they bring it back home again to their families and their communities. Often, Chicago's communities that are already hardest hit by the pandemic.
And we know the county jail is seeing a spike right now as well, with 307 detainees testing positive and 207 staff members testing positive. Now, we should know the sheriff's office says that 63% of those positive detainees, they tested positive at admission, indicating that they contracted it in the community before being admitted to the jail. But in a statement, we also know that the sheriff's office says, quote, as a part of the office's comprehensive prevention efforts, vaccination is repeatedly offered and encouraged among staff and those ordered to custody. As of today, more than 78% of Cook County Sheriff's staff and 67% of eligible individuals in custody have received the vaccine. Amanda, what is your reaction to how the jail has handled the COVID pandemic?
Look, with the rapid spread of Omicron variant, jails are once again the sites of major outbreaks across the United States. We know that jails in Illinois and across the United States are overcrowded, they're unsanitary, they're poorly ventilated. You have people living double bunked in 6 by 6 foot cells or large bunk rooms with hundreds of people sharing a bathroom. And in those crowded conditions, social distancing is all but impossible. Those conditions are inhumane right now. We have created taxpayer-funded disease incubators, intensifying the spread of COVID in our communities.
Okay, so it sounds like you'd like to hear a lot more being done in that case, but that is where we'll have to leave it tonight. Amanda Klonsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And up next, a new look at the elusive photographer Vivian Maier. Stay with us.
Thousands of Puerto Ricans are taking to the streets to protest massive blackouts.
Over the years, Mexican culture, from food to music, has become woven into the city's tapestry.
Medical professionals share the latest recommendations on COVID-19 booster shots.
DACA recipients have been facing longer delays than normal in their status renewal.
Little Village is one of my favorite neighborhoods. This neighborhood comes together to celebrate such an important day in our culture.
There has always been an air of mystery surrounding the life of Vivian Maier. Maier, as you may know, was a North Shore nanny who quietly pursued another endeavor. In her spare time, she took extraordinary photographs. Her body of work, 140,000 images, was discovered in a Chicago storage locker in 2007. And the photographs were not attributed to her until she died 2 years later. Our own Jay Shefsky first reported on the phenom before her life became the subject of a 2014 documentary. Now, a new biography aims to answer some of the many questions that still surround Vivian Maier. It's called Vivian Maier Developed: The Untold Story of the Photographer Nanny. And joining us is author Ann Marks. Ann Marks, welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm told you worked on this project for 5 years. There was a lot to uncover here, but before we get to the backstory, remind our viewers why her work is so universally praised by photographers.
Well, I think there's two aspects to it. Certainly her mastery of the art. I think the Mary Ellen Mark, the famous photographer, said it best. She had a great sense of environment and light, and she had a great eye. She covered tragedy, she covered humor, she covered irony, and she just had it all.
And despite this, she's known, at least to us at this point, as an intensely private person. Not much was known about her background. What did your research uncover?
It uncovered a lot of things. The big thing that was missing was her entire childhood. You know, when she was in Chicago, she really divorced herself from that and hid it. So no one even knew her real background. Even the Ginsburg family, who knew her until she died, thought she had been born in France. And of course, we now know she was born in New York.
She was born in New York. She spent time in France, and then she came back to New York. And the common knowledge was she never really pursued photography as a vocation, but your research found that, in fact, she was very ambitious in her early years about photography. Explain that.
Well, in New York, she actually tried to be a commercial photographer, and up until I did my research, no one had found anybody that knew her in New York, so that hadn't been uncovered. But she really started photography through the prism of a commercial effort when she was taking her photographs in France in 1950, which is the first time she picked up a camera. She was taking most of her photographs of the landscapes in France to make postcards. And that was really her goal. And she continued that even when she came to New York. So she always had, at least originally, a commercial motivation in mind.
And beyond the landscape, she was known for her portraits of the working man and woman on the street in New York and Chicago. Was this perhaps a result of coming from a broken family life?
It may be that, but she never really looked at herself as an underdog. She was so intelligent and so progressive that she just saw the whole world as something she wanted to photograph. And it's actually very interesting because I've seen her entire archive of 143,000 images, And it's amazing, even early on, how she was showing integrated situations where children were playing together. She was going to worker rallies. She was, supporting women's rights literally 10 years before all of that came to the forefront in the 1960s. And you could see that throughout her portfolio.
You can also see a lot of self-portraits before selfies were a thing that they are now. What motivated her work, taking pictures of herself through windows or glass or what have you?
Her self-portraits are really one of the most amazing aspects of her work. When I started this project, we had about 200 Vivian Maier self-portraits, and by the end of it, I found 585 of them. So she was very prolific, and she took them throughout her life. And I was able to correlate the type of self-portraits she was doing with what was going on in her life. So for instance, in New York, when she was pursuing commercial photography, most of her self-portraits portrayed her as a photographer. So it's really, really interesting to look at the whole gamut of what she was doing. And they were also very creative and changed scope and form throughout her career.
And as many know, that she spent so many years as a nanny in the North Shore. People described her at once as being charismatic and outgoing, or mean and introverted. What did you discover about her mental state and her personality?
Well, I think she was all the things that people described, and there were a lot of contrasting adjectives. It just depended on the situation and who she was with. And if she got to know you well, as she did the Ginsburg family, she was lovely and funny, and sometimes she was detached because she had this traumatic childhood and she really had trouble establishing and sustaining relationships with people. And so she could seem cold and distant.
The Ginsburg family, of course, the family she worked with in Highland Park. So in your research, did you find an answer to the question of why she let most of her work stay hidden as she worked as a nanny and didn't pursue this as a vocation, at least in her later years?
Yes, well, what happened was, it's common knowledge that Vivian Maier had a severe hoarding disorder, and she was hoarding newspapers. And I've studied that disorder quite a bit and talked to some of the foremost experts. And it turns out that photographs and newspapers are part of the same category of collecting paper, and they provide the same benefits. And so Vivian was collecting newspapers. She was attracted to the typefaces and the information, and she was keeping little pieces of life for herself. And photographs did the same thing. So by the time she turned 30 and she moved to Chicago, she was hoarding photographs too, and she was unable to let go of her photographs even if she had wanted to.
So much to uncover here, Ann Marks. Congratulations on the book and adding more to the canon of this posthumously famous photographer that we've heard so much about. Our thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
And again, the book is called Vivian Maier Developed, the Untold Story of the Photographer Nanny. Find out more and see photos by Vivian Maier on our website. And up next, celebrating a Michigan Avenue icon in an encore edition of Ask Jeffrey.
Ask Jeffrey on WTTW is made possible in part by Binny's Beverage Depot. Since 1948, Binny's has remained local, family-owned, and dedicated to helping you celebrate the best times in your life.
Binny's Beverage Depot toasts Chicago's proud history and its people. Since 1948, Binny's has remained local, family-owned, and dedicated to helping you celebrate the best times of your life.
A Chicago icon turns 100 this year, and Jeffrey Maier is here to tell us all about it in tonight's edition of Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, welcome back. Good to have you in the studio.
Here I am in the studio. It's
once
great.
again. So tell us, what impact did the Wrigley Building have on Michigan Avenue?
Well, when the Wrigley Building opened in 1921, it inaugurated this era of the Magnificent Mile. Now, some people today are saying that the Magnificent Mile is maybe not as magnificent as it's been with the closing of stores like Macy's and the Gap, the Disney Store, and more. But the Wrigley Building has stood the test of time. A little over a century ago, the street now known as the Mag Mile, lined with restaurants, stores, and historic skyscrapers, was little more than a country road called Pine Street, extending north from the smelly Chicago River, which was lined with docks, wharves, factories, and railroad tracks. But a transformation was about to begin with the opening of the Michigan Avenue Bridge, now DuSable Bridge, in 1920, followed just a year later by the Wrigley Building.
The area where we're standing right now would be an area that maybe you wouldn't want to be in because it would be at the heart of industry.
Right behind where the Wrigley Building is was a cheese factory, notoriously odorous, as you can imagine. Across the street, they made soap.
To many people, this must have seemed like a crazy place to build a gleaming skyscraper. But for chewing gum mogul William Wrigley Jr., it was a masterstroke by a master of promotion.
William Wrigley, was a man with a lot of energy. I don't know how he got everything done that he did, because he was running this company, which was a global corporation, but then he was also running a baseball team.
The Wrigley Building was the first skyscraper north of the Chicago River. Designed by architects Graham Anderson Probst and White, it was part of the City Beautiful movement, a style that grew out of Daniel Burnham's wildly popular, classically inspired White City at Chicago's 1893 World's Fair.
It's just what really appealed to people. Even though we were a relatively new country, still our beacon, what we were hearkening back to was Europe, right? And so we wanted those old styles. We thought that that's what showed importance.
The shiny exterior looks all white, but there are actually 6 slightly different shades of glazed terracotta tiles to draw your eye upward.
The bottom here, it's got a lot of blue in it, kind of a little bit darker. And then as it goes up, they add more and more of lighter color until right at the top, it's this shining white tower that's visible from far away.
A jog in Michigan Avenue gave shoppers and business people in the Loop an unobstructed view of Mr. Wrigley's building, like an all-white version of the Emerald City at the end of the yellow brick road. Encrusted in so much classical ornament, it seems like they ran out of room on the walls. Look at all the detail they put up here that no one can see from the street. We are on the roof.
At the top of that tower, you see a clock face, and that clock face is about 2 stories worth of the building itself, but it's fully electric. And so that makes it keep almost near perfect time, and it becomes this important way of Chicagoans being able to orient themselves.
And, of course, it gave people another reason to look at Mr. Wrigley's building. The clock tower was inspired by the bell tower of the Seville Cathedral in Spain, originally a minaret when the cathedral was a mosque. So who sets the hands? Like who changes the time on the clock?
We have to do it the old-fashioned way with radios and making sure that we have somebody calling up and saying, okay, it's this time, what time do you see? And then we'll move it.
Above the clock was an observation deck. Each visitor got a piece of Wrigley gum. The observation deck was yet another part of Wrigley's strategy of using the building to promote his business almost subliminally.
Wrigley's name isn't on the building, but you can see his building pretty much anywhere in the city of Chicago. It just sort of stands out and dominates the landscape.
Mr. Wrigley even made sure the building would stand out after dark, lighting its exterior from day one.
There are lights across the river. So on Wacker Drive, Lower Wacker, we have lights. Across the street, on the Median, we have lights. We have partnerships with a couple buildings because we have some lights on some rooftops.
The Wrigley family finally sold the building in 2011, but in the spirit of William Wrigley, the building's current owner has pulled out all the stops to celebrate its 100th birthday, including a promotional stunt Mr. Wrigley would likely have loved. The owners held a contest for 100 people to get married at the building. 370 couples entered the contest.
People really wrote these beautiful essays about what the building means to them. It's something intangible.
Today, the Mag Mile is once again at a critical point in its history. As more consumers shop online and major stores shutter their locations on the avenue, some say the iconic street needs to be reimagined.
I think what we're trying to look at now is what can we do that makes it more experiential? Like, what's something that you can come down and not just go in and shop and buy something, but experience something?
Like the Starbucks Roastery or the Ice Cream Museum planned to open across the street in Tribune Tower, and proposed attractions in vacant stores based on Harry Potter and King Tut. But as Michigan Avenue adjusts, the Wrigley building will continue to be a gateway.
It still remains like an important landmark here on Michigan Avenue that makes people like stand and look with awe and wonder.
It means something. It really means something. It means hope. It's a beacon.
And Jeffrey, you know, as the building's owners look to the future, they're also making the historic lighting more sustainable.
That's right. The lights that shine on the building take up a lot of power, and they are upgrading the lighting system. Now they're adding lights. There are 100 lights now. There are going to be 300 lights, but they are LED lights, so they will actually decrease the electricity use by 60 to 70%.
And I'm impressed that you weren't fazed by being up on that roof so high up, Jeffrey.
Oh, it was fun.
All right, Jeffrey Maier, thanks. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
And we're back to wrap things up right after this, but first, a look at the weather.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that is our show for this Tuesday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. From excused absences for mental health to lifting limits on students' locks, we will take a look at the many new laws taking effect next year.
Plus, one-on-one with Chicago's Public Health Commissioner on new COVID restrictions and still rising cases. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great evening.
Closed captioning is made possible in part by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, wishing all a happy and healthy holiday season.